dorm that shouldn't be there. When I transferred to Crestwood College, I was desperate for a fresh start. My last school had been a disaster. Terrible roommates, grades slipping, and no social life to speak of. Crestwood had a reputation for being quiet and quaint, nestled in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick forests. Seemed perfect, almost too perfect. I arrived in mid-January, and the campus was eerily empty. Classes wouldn't start for another week, so only a handful of students were moving in early. I was assigned to a dorm called Ellicott Hall. It wasn't listed on the college website or shown on the campus map, but I figured it must have been one of the older buildings. When I arrived, the place gave me an odd feeling right away. The building stood apart from the others, just past the Treeline. It was smaller and older than the rest, with peeling paint and cracked windows. It looked abandoned, but the email had been clear. Room 205, Ellicott Hall. Looks cozy, my dad joked as we unloaded my bags. His forced smile told me he was just trying to keep the mood light. I shrugged it off. Plenty of old campuses had creepy buildings. Inside, the dorm smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. The lights buzzed faintly, casting long, flickering shadows. The staircase creaked under our weight as we climbed to the second floor. We found room 205 at the end of a dimly lit hall. The door looked like it hadn't been opened in years, but the key worked, and the lock clicked easily. My dad pushed the door open, revealing a small, dusty room with a single bed, a desk, and a window that barely let in any light. "Well, it's rustic," he said, setting my suitcase on the bed. "Yeah, it's fine," I replied, trying not to sound ungrateful. It wasn't like I had many other options. After he helped me unpack, my dad left, promising to check in the next day. As the sound of his car faded into the distance, the silence of Ellicott Hall became deafening. I sat on the bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to ignore the unsettling atmosphere. That's when I noticed something strange. There was no Wi-Fi signal, not even the campus network. I tried sending a text to my dad, but it wouldn't go through. I figured the building's old walls were just blocking the signal. That first night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise, creaking floorboards, faint scratching sounds, the groan of the old pipes, kept me on edge. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hall. I wasn't alone in the dorm after all, I thought with some relief. Maybe I could introduce myself to my neighbor in the morning. The next day, I wandered the campus, trying to shake the unease from the night before. Crestwood was beautiful, with its snow-covered grounds and historic buildings. But when I mentioned Ellicott Hall to other students I met, I got strange looks. "Ellicott Hall?" one girl repeated, furrowing her brow. "I've never heard of it." Another student laughed. "Are you messing with me? There's no Ellicott Hall here." I pulled up the email from the housing office, but when I looked at it again, something was wrong. The message looked corrupted. The text was garbled, and the Crestwood logo was distorted, like an old VHS tape left in the sun too long. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. That night, back in room 205, I decided to ask my neighbor if they'd had the same experience. The door across the hall from mine, room 206, had been cracked open slightly when I arrived, so I figured someone must live there. I knocked lightly. "Hey, I just moved in." I thought I'd introduce myself. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, and the door creaked open wider. Against my better judgment, I peeked inside. The room was empty. Not just empty, abandoned. The bed frame was broken, the mattress rotted, and the walls were covered in black mold. A smell hit me like a punch to the gut. Something damp and sour, like decay. I stumbled back into the hall, slamming the door shut. My heart was racing. That night, I couldn't stay in my room. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and I kept hearing faint whispers, just at the edge of my hearing. I grabbed my jacket and wandered outside, hoping the cold air would clear my head. The campus was silent. The fog had rolled in thick, obscuring the buildings around me. I found myself walking toward the library, one of the few places still open late. As I approached, I saw someone standing by the entrance. "Hey," I called out, relieved to see another person. "Do you know The figure turned, and my voice caught in my throat. It was a girl, maybe my age, but her face was pale, almost translucent. Her eyes were sunken, and her hair hung in wet, matted clumps. She stared at me, unblinking, before turning and walking away into the fog. "Wait!" I shouted, but she was gone. Shaking, I headed back to Ellicott Hall. It felt like the only place I could go, even though every instinct told me to leave. That night, the whispers grew louder. They weren't in my head. They were coming from the hall. I cracked my door open and peeked out, and my blood ran cold. The hallway was filled with people. Students, all pale and hollow-eyed, standing silently, staring at the walls. They moved in unison, turning their heads slowly, as if searching for something. And then, one by one, they turned to face me. I slammed the door and locked it, backing away until I hit the wall. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, until they were deafening. I screamed. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the ground outside, snow soaking through my clothes. The sun was rising, and the campus was alive with students heading to their morning classes. "Ellicott Hall," I mumbled, grabbing a passing student's arm. "Where is it?" The student looked at me like I was crazy. "What are you talking about? There's no Ellicott Hall." I turned and pointed, but where the dorm had been, there was nothing. Just trees and an empty clearing. My suitcase, my belongings, everything was gone. I left Crestwood that day. I didn't tell anyone what happened. What could I say? That I lived in a dorm that didn't exist? But sometimes, late at night, I dream of Ellicott Hall. I see the pale faces in the hallway, hear the whispers, and feel the crushing weight of the silence. I've checked the college's records since, but there's no mention of Ellicott Hall, no photos, no history. But I know it was real, and I know that whatever was in there is still waiting. The final lesson. I'll never forget the first time I set foot in Brookhaven College. The campus was beautiful, sprawling greens, historic brick buildings, and towering oak trees that swayed gently in the breeze. But the centerpiece, the main building, Calder Hall, always gave me the creeps. It was an imposing Gothic structure, 5 stories tall, with spires that seemed to scrape the sky. For as long as anyone could remember, Calder Hall had been a breeding ground for ghost stories. Freshman year, I thought the stories were just that. Stories. Everyone loved to talk about the girl in the window, a ghostly figure who supposedly appeared on the top floor late at night. There were also whispers about strange noises, doors slamming on their own, and the occasional student claiming to hear someone whisper their name when no one was around. It all seemed like harmless fun, until my senior year. I was majoring in history, and Professor DeWitt, who taught history of superstition and folklore, decided to host a final project in Calder Hall. He claimed it was fitting for the subject matter. We'd split into small groups, research Calder's long, eerie history, and present our findings. It sounded like an easy A, but none of us were thrilled about spending late nights in the building, especially not on the top floor, where the girl in the window was said to reside. Our group was small: me, my roommate Alex, a quiet girl named Mia, and Thomas, who was always cracking jokes to cover his nervous energy. We met at Calder Hall on a foggy Friday night, our supplies in hand. The building was locked, but DeWitt had given us a key. As I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the hinges groaned, echoing through the empty halls. "Why does it already feel like a horror movie?" Alex muttered, holding a flashlight under his chin for dramatic effect. "Because it is a horror movie," Thomas joked, though his laugh was forced. Mia didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring up the grand staircase that led to the upper floors. The first few hours weren't too bad. We set up in an old lecture room on the 3rd floor, laying out our notebooks and laptops. The air was musty, and the single overhead light flickered occasionally, but we stayed focused. I was assigned to research the building's history, while Alex and Thomas sifted through urban legends, and Mia took notes. "Did you know this place used to be a boarding school?" Alex said, scrolling through an old article on his laptop. "Apparently, there was a fire back in the 1940s. They rebuilt most of it, but there were a few casualties, Yeah, I heard about that, I said. They say that's when the hauntings started. Casualties like students? Mia asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex nodded. 3 girls, according to this article. And get this, one of them was never found. People think she's the girl in the window. Okay, let's not freak ourselves out, Thomas said, leaning back in his chair. It's just a story. If ghosts were real, I'm pretty sure they'd have better things to do than haunt some random building. That's when we heard it, the sound of footsteps above us. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. We froze. Tell me one of you heard that, Alex said, his face pale. It's probably just the building settling, I offered, though I didn't believe it. But then the footsteps started again, this time faster, like someone running across the floor directly above us. We're on the 3rd floor, Mia said. There's no one above us. Nope, I'm not doing this, Thomas said, standing up and heading for the door. I don't care about the project. I'm not getting haunted for a grade. Wait, I said, grabbing his arm. Let's just check it out. If we find nothing, we'll leave. You want to go up there? Alex asked, his voice shaking. Are you insane? I didn't want to go, but something inside me, call it curiosity or stupidity, pushed me forward. Against their better judgment, the others followed. The 4th floor was even darker than the 3rd. Most of the windows were boarded up, and the fog outside made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Our flashlights cut through the gloom, illuminating dusty furniture and cobweb-covered walls. See? Nothing, I said, trying to convince myself as much as them. But then we heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were coming from the end of the hall. Slowly, we crept forward, our footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The air grew colder with each step, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. At the end of the hall was a door marked storage. It was slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling out. I'm not going in there, Thomas said, shaking his head. I'll go, Mia said suddenly. We all stared at her. She hadn't spoken much all night, but now there was a strange determination in her eyes. Before I could stop her, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and cluttered, filled with broken desks, old textbooks, and filing cabinets. In the center of the room was an antique mirror, its surface cloudy with age. Why is there a mirror here? Alex asked, shining his flashlight on it. Mia didn't answer. She just walked up to the mirror, staring at her reflection. Then, in a voice that didn't sound like hers, she said, "She's here." The lights flickered violently, and the door slammed shut behind us. The air was so cold it burned, and the footsteps returned, now pounding in a deafening rhythm. "Mia, what are you doing?" I shouted, grabbing her arm, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed on the mirror. I looked at it, and my stomach dropped. In the reflection, there were 5 of us. But the 5th figure wasn't human. It was a girl in a tattered dress, her face obscured by a veil of dark hair. "She wants to come back," Mia whispered. "She wants." The mirror shattered, and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the 3rd floor lecture room. Alex and Thomas were next to me, groaning as they came to. Mia was gone. "What happened?" Alex asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," I said, trying to piece it together. "Mia, she..." A loud crash interrupted me, and we turned to see the door to the hall swinging open. Standing in the doorway was Mia, or at least something that looked like her. Her eyes were black, her skin pale as death, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "She's free now," she said in that same unnatural voice. Before we could move, she lunged at us, faster than anything I'd ever seen. We ran, tripping over desks and chairs, the sound of her laughter echoing behind us. We made it out of Calder Hall, but Mia was never found. The official story was that she ran away, but I know the truth. I see her sometimes, in my nightmares and in the windows of Calder Hall, staring at me with that awful smile. We let her out, and now she'll never leave. The final exam. I had always heard rumors about Aldrich Hall. Every college has its legends, and ours was no exception. It wasn't just the oldest building on campus. It was a place steeped in infamy. Students whispered about the strange happenings there. Objects moving on their own, shadows where no one stood, and the faint sound of sobbing in the dead of night. But the scariest tale was about room 308, the room where Professor Stanton supposedly lost his mind decades ago and disappeared without a trace. I didn't believe in any of it. Ghost stories were just distractions, invented to keep bored college students entertained. At least, that's what I thought before I stepped foot in Aldrich Hall myself. It started innocently enough. I was part of a study group preparing for our history final. Finals week was brutal, and the library was packed, leaving us without a quiet place to work. My friend Rachel suggested we use Aldrich Hall. She said she knew how to get inside despite the building being condemned. I should have said no, but desperation outweighed my unease. That's how, on a chilly December night, I found myself standing at the locked gates of Aldrich Hall with Rachel, Ben, and Carla. "Are you sure about this?" I asked Rachel as she worked on picking the lock. "Relax," she said, grinning. "It's just a creepy old building. What's the worst that could happen?" Her words echoed in my mind later that night. The inside of Aldrich Hall was exactly as I imagined. Dark, dusty, and cold. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and our footsteps echoed unnervingly as we moved through the empty corridors. Ben carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. "This place gives me the creeps," Carla muttered, hugging her arms. "Why couldn't we just go to your dorm?" Rachel rolled her eyes. "Because your dorm is loud, and this place is empty. Besides, think of the bragging rights. How many people can say they've studied in a haunted building? Hopefully none," I muttered under my breath, but no one heard me. We made our way to a classroom on the second floor, settling into dusty chairs and setting up our laptops and books. For the first hour, everything was fine. We quizzed each other, joked around, and focused on cramming as much information as possible. I almost forgot we were in the most notorious building on campus until the lights started flickering. "That's weird," Ben said, glancing at the exposed bulb dangling from the ceiling. "Probably just old wiring." "Yeah, sure," Carla said nervously. "Old wiring." Rachel didn't even look up from her notes. "Calm down, guys. It's an abandoned building. What did you expect?" I tried to brush it off, but then the temperature dropped. One minute I was warm in my sweater. The next I was shivering so hard my teeth chattered. I wasn't the only one who noticed. "Why is it so cold all of a sudden?" Carla asked, rubbing her arms. Before anyone could answer, we heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the hallway. It was soft at first, like a mouse scurrying along the floor, but it grew louder and more insistent. "What the hell is that?" Ben whispered. Rachel stood up, her expression defiant. "Probably just a raccoon or something. I'll check it out." "Don't," I said quickly, grabbing her arm. "We're not supposed to be here. Let's just pack up and go." But Rachel was already heading for the door, flashlight in hand. Against my better judgment, the rest of us followed her. The hallway was darker than before, the flickering light from the classroom casting long, eerie shadows. The scratching noise continued, now coming from the far end of the corridor. Rachel led the way, her flashlight trembling slightly as she pointed it ahead. "See," she said. "Nothing but—" Her sentence cut off as the beam of light landed on a door. "Room 308. "Of course," Carla muttered. "The haunted room." "We're not going in there," I said firmly. But Rachel ignored me, her curiosity getting the better of her. She reached for the doorknob, and to my horror, the door creaked open on its own. The room was just as ominous as the rest of the building. Broken desks and chairs were piled in the corners, and the windows were boarded up, allowing only slivers of moonlight to seep through. In the center of the room was a single desk, untouched by dust or decay. It looked as though someone had just been sitting there. "I don't like this," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Relax," Rachel said, though her voice wavered. "It's just a room." But it wasn't just a room. As we stood there, the air grew heavier, pressing down on us like an invisible weight. The scratching sound returned, this time louder and coming from the walls. Then we heard it. A faint, raspy whisper. "Leave," Carla screamed, and I felt my blood turn to ice. The voice wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the desk. Rachel stepped closer, her flashlight illuminating a stack of old papers on the desk. They were yellowed with age, and the handwriting was erratic, almost frenzied. She picked one up and began to read aloud. They told me I was crazy, but I saw it. I saw what hides in the shadows, what waits for us when we're alone. It watches, it waits, it hungers. "Stop," I said, my voice shaking. "Please, just stop." But before she could respond, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. Panic set in. Carla was crying, Ben was pounding on the door, and Rachel was shouting for us to calm down. But then we heard it again, the whispering. It was louder now, coming from all around us, overlapping voices that made no sense. Something moved in the corner of the room. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, but I could see it. A shadow, darker than the rest, shifting and growing. It stretched across the floor, tendrils reaching for us like hands. "Run!" I shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The door wouldn't budge, and the windows were sealed. The shadow crept closer, and with it came a sound I'll never forget. A low, guttural growl. Suddenly, Rachel screamed. I turned to see her being dragged toward the desk by something unseen. She clawed at the floor, her eyes wide with terror, but whatever had her was too strong. "Help me!" she cried, but we were frozen in fear. Before we could react, the shadow enveloped her. Her scream cut off abruptly, and then she was gone. The room fell silent. We managed to get out somehow. I don't remember how the door opened or how we stumbled back into the night, but when we reached the safety of campus, Rachel wasn't with us. We told the campus police everything, but they didn't believe us. They searched Aldrich Hall the next day but found no sign of Rachel or the room we described. Room 308 didn't exist. I don't know what happened that night, but I still hear her voice sometimes, calling for help, and I can't help but wonder if one day I'll join her. Whispers of Prescott Hall. I never paid much attention to ghost stories. They were just urban legends, the kind of things people made up to scare freshmen. That's what I told myself when I first heard about Prescott Hall, the oldest building on our college campus. It was closed to students, condemned, they said, but everyone whispered that it was haunted. Apparently, back in the 1960s, a student named Lila fell to her death from the 3rd floor. Some said it was an accident, others swore she jumped, but the most chilling version claimed she was pushed. Since then, people reported strange happenings. Lights flickering in the windows, faint crying echoing in the hallways, and, most famously, the sound of scratching on the locked doors as if something inside was trying to get out. It was all just nonsense, I thought, until that night. It was the week before finals, and I'd been pulling late-night study sessions with my friends, Mia and Carter. We were all exhausted, sick of coffee and textbooks, and desperate for a distraction. That's when Carter suggested we break into Prescott Hall. "Come on," he said, grinning like a kid with a secret. "What's the worst that could happen? A little scare might actually wake us up." Mia rolled her eyes, but I could tell she was intrigued. She always pretended to be the rational one, but deep down, she loved spooky stuff. As for me, I don't know why I agreed. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe I just didn't want to look like a coward. So, at 11 p.m., we grabbed flashlights and made our way to Prescott Hall. The building loomed over us like a shadow, its Gothic architecture even more imposing at night. The windows were boarded up, and the heavy wooden doors were chained shut. Carter had come prepared, though. With a crowbar, he pried open one of the side entrances, and we slipped inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and decay. Our footsteps echoed on the cracked tile floor as we made our way down the main hallway. The only light came from our flashlights, which cast long, flickering shadows on the peeling walls. "Okay," Mia whispered, "we're here. Now what?" Carter smirked. "We explore." See if Lila wants to say hi. I forced a laugh, but my stomach was already in knots. There was something about the silence of the place, the way it seemed to swallow our voices, that made my skin crawl. We started on the first floor, peeking into empty classrooms filled with broken desks and cobwebs. Nothing unusual. But then we reached the staircase leading to the second floor, and that's when things started to feel wrong. The temperature dropped suddenly, so sharply that I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. Mia hugged herself, shivering. Did it just get freezing in here? Carter brushed it off. Old buildings are drafty. Come on, scaredy cats. Reluctantly, we followed him up the stairs. The second floor was worse. The air felt heavier, and every step we took seemed louder, as if the building itself was listening. We passed a row of lockers, their doors hanging open, and I thought I heard something, faint like a whisper. Did you hear that? I asked, stopping in my tracks. Hear what? Carter turned to look at me, but his cocky grin faltered. Mia grabbed my arm. No, I heard it too. It was like someone talking. We all stood there, holding our breath, straining to hear. And then it came again, louder this time. A soft, shuddering sob coming from down the hallway. Probably just the wind, Carter said, but his voice was shaky. Wind doesn't cry, Mia shot back. We should have left. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around and get out, but Carter was already walking toward the sound. Mia and I had no choice but to follow. The sobbing led us to a classroom at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swung open under Carter's push. Inside, the room was empty. Desks and chairs were overturned, and the blackboard was covered in illegible chalk scribbles. But what caught my attention was the window. It was shattered, shards of glass glittering on the floor, and the fog outside seemed to press against the frame like it was alive. Is this where she, you know? Mia whispered. Carter nodded. Third floor, actually. But maybe she liked to hang out here. As if in response, the sobbing started again, this time from upstairs. We climbed to the third floor in silence, the tension thick enough to choke on. The stairs groaned under our weight, and I swear I felt the building shudder, as if it were alive. The third floor was even colder than the rest of the building. The walls were lined with broken windows, and the fog outside seemed thicker, swirling unnaturally. At the far end of the hallway was the room where Lila had fallen. The door was closed, but as we approached, we noticed something scratched into the wood. Help me! The words were jagged, deep enough to splinter the wood. My stomach turned. This isn't funny anymore, Mia said, her voice trembling. We should go. But Carter was already pushing the door open. The room was empty, just like the others, but the atmosphere was suffocating. The walls were covered in more scratches. The same phrase repeated over and over. Help me, help me, help me. And then the door slammed shut behind us. We spun around, panicked, but the door wouldn't budge. The temperature plummeted further, and our flashlights started to flicker. That's when we heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the walls. It grew louder, more frantic, until it was deafening. Mia screamed, clutching her head, and Carter yelled, "What the hell is happening?" I tried to stay calm, but then the whispers started. A cacophony of voices, overlapping and echoing, growing louder and louder until one voice cut through them all. "Why did you come here?" The voice was sharp, angry, and so close it felt like it was right in my ear. I turned, and that's when I saw her. Lila. She was standing by the window, her figure pale and translucent, her hair matted and wild. Her eyes were black pits, and her mouth stretched into a twisted, unnatural smile. "You shouldn't have come," she hissed, and suddenly the room was spinning. The walls seemed to close in, the scratches turning into deep gouges that oozed dark liquid. Mia was sobbing, Carter was banging on the door, and I couldn't move. Lila stepped closer, her feet not touching the ground. "Stay with me," she whispered, reaching out. Her hand was cold as death when it brushed my arm, and my vision went dark. When I woke up, I was outside, lying on the grass in front of Prescott Hall. Carter and Mia were there too, pale and shaking. The building was silent, the fog gone. We never spoke about what happened that night, but sometimes late at night, I still hear the whispers.